We are cognizant of the fact that the state trial reached its conclusion over the weekend. As parents, as engaged citizens, and as leaders who stand vigilant against violence in communities across the country, the Deltas are deeply and rightly concerned about this case. The Justice Department shares your concern. I share your concern.
Welcome back to Hardball. Not guilty. That was the final decision by the Florida jury acquitting George Zimmerman of all charges in the killing of Trayvon Martin, but those weren't, in fact, the last words in this case, as we've been seeing. Attorney General Holder, who you saw just there, says his Department of Justice has placed the case under review as it examines whether or not Zimmerman violated any civil rights statutes. Well, some 450,000 people have signed an NAACP petition urging the Justice Department to file those charges. Well, the Martin family is looking at its own options as well. Attorneys for the family, they're considering filing civil charges, a strategy that has been successful in prior high-profile cases. Of course, the O.J. Simpson trial was one where the civil charges against O.J. Simpson were successful. Anyway, the burden of proof to win a case in such a matter is less stringent than in criminal cases. It's easier to win a civil case. A preponderance of evidence standard is used in civil cases, which means the greater weight of evidence must favor the plaintiff, but it's a much lower bar than what the prosecution had to prove of beyond a reasonable doubt in the criminal case. And because criminal prosecution is now off the table, Zimmerman could be forced to testify about himself. So what's the next chapter for George Zimmerman and, of course, the Martin family? For the latest on this, we're going to go to NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams. Pete, when you're looking at this coldly, what do you see as prospects for further action here?
I think they're unlikely, and here's the reason. The closest fit under federal law would be the 4-year-old federal hate crimes law. And what it says is that for a person to be punished under the federal system for this kind of a crime, you have to show that bodily injury was the result, was caused by someone's racial perception or the belief that they attacked the victim because of race. That's the difficult thing here. Now, the federal government could well look at evidence. There's been an argument here that it all started because George Zimmerman, the race was a factor, that Trayvon Martin's factor was a race, that's why he started following him. But in essence, what the federal law requires is that you persuade a jury that the reason George Zimmerman pulled the trigger was because of Trayvon Martin's race and not some other factor such as self-defense. The further away you get from the shooting itself and you go to some other part of the chain of events, no matter how it may have started, the further away you get away from that, the harder it is to make a case. And I've talked to several former prosecutors in the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, and they all say the same thing. Proving someone's intent is one of the hardest things to do in the law. So I think it would be surprising, Chris, if the federal government brings a prosecution based on what we know now. Now, it may be that their investigation will uncover something different, but if it doesn't, if it relies largely on the evidence that we've already seen, then I think federal prosecution is unlikely.
I don't know whether you can help me or not, but I've been trying to make the case tonight that the reason for the anger over this trial from a lot of Americans comes from a number of sources. Certainly a history of racial behavior in this country, starting with slavery and Jim Crow. Most of our history has been bad in that regard. White people's behavior towards black people, to put it bluntly. And then you have this whole question of profiling and whether George Zimmerman went out there with an attitude that this fellow, because he was African-American, was guilty, and therefore it treated him that way in their conversations, if you will. And then separating all that from the difference between what happened between these two gentlemen when they met that night, which is the essence of what the jury had to decide. Do you have to argue to win a civil rights case in this matter that he shot him on sight, that there wasn't a scuffle, that there wasn't a fear of great bodily harm?
Or you have to prove at least that the reason that he shot him, more than anything else, beyond a reasonable doubt, was that it was because of his race and not because he feared for his life or his safety or something else. What you say about the reason for the public outrage may well be true, but to try to place all that on the back of this admittedly difficult standard in the federal hate crimes law is a very tall order, Chris. And the prosecutors who have brought these cases say they succeed when there is really strong evidence of a person's bias. They're making statements while they attack someone. They tell other people in advance that they're going to go out and try to attack someone who's black or someone who's gay or someone who's a Muslim or whatever. You have to have other kinds of evidence.
Yeah. Thanks, Pete. You're always great. Pete Williams, Justice Correspondent for NBC News. We're joined now by someone very much involved in this matter, Jasmine Rand. She's an attorney representing the Martin family. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Rand. Can you tell us what your feelings and thoughts are now about the future in this case?
You know, yesterday or Saturday was certainly heartbreaking for the legal team and for the family. It was a big disappointment for us to get a not guilty verdict. But we want the people to know that not guilty does not mean that George Zimmerman was innocent. And right now, in this moment, more than anything, you know, I think that we are feeling inspired and hopeful by all of the love and encouragement that we've literally gotten from all over the world. I've had calls from Morocco, from London, from Jamaica, and this outpour of love. And I think that that's what the family is standing on now. We've heard the words of our president. We've heard the words of Attorney General Eric Holder, who says he plans to pursue the federal hate crime charges against George Zimmerman, or plans to continue the investigation. So right now we're feeling hopeful that the federal government will step in and do what the state did not do and what the jury did not do. And I hate to steal the words of Don West, but it was a tragedy to get an acquittal in Florida State Court. It will be a travesty not to bring the federal charges against George Zimmerman.
Well, Pete Williams was just on. I want to ask you about, repeat what he asked. I'm not an expert. I'm not an attorney like yourself. But do you have to prove it was basically shooting on sight? That I've heard some earlier charges in the beginning of this when it was very outraged in the country, that he saw a young black man, shot him because he met the profile, his own profile in his head of who was committing these burglaries. And my question to you is, if it did involve a scuffle, if his head was hit a number of times, maybe not 25 times, maybe his testimony isn't accurate, but if there was a scuffle that involved the danger of bodily harm, can you still prove that the reason he shot the guy, the poor young kid, was because he was black? Can you prove he waited till his head was hit 3 times and then shot him because he was black, or hit him or shot him because he was a fear of his life? How do you separate those two possibilities for a jury?
You know, first, I don't think there's any statute on law that says you have to shoot somebody first. And I certainly think that in this case, we have a tremendous amount of evidence. What would be the story
you would tell a federal jury? What story would you say? What would be your scenario of what happened?
I think that George Zimmerman placed, 46 calls throughout a short period of time reporting black men as suspicious in the neighborhood. He got out of that car saying these effing a-holes always get away. He followed Trayvon Martin with a loaded gun, and that loaded gun, when he pulled the trigger, the thing that pulled the trigger was his hate in his heart for African-American people. And we heard the defense say it over and over, whether or not they said...
Okay, let's get back to the incident. You said he carried a loaded gun. Was he carrying it, or was it in his holster?
Nobody can say whether he was carrying...
You said he was carrying it.
What I meant was he was carrying it on his person. I don't know at which point he placed it. And you say he had the intention
of shooting. This will be your case. I think it's very important you make it clear. He went out with the intention of killing a black man.
I don't think he got out of the car saying, I'm going to go kill a black man tonight. I think that he followed Trayvon Martin because he was black. I think that he assumed he was committing criminal activity because he was black. And I think that he put a bullet in his heart because Trayvon Martin was black. Because if it had not been for the color of his skin, I do not believe George Zimmerman would have begun following him to begin with.
Do you believe he had felt any danger of his life or bodily injury when they were scuffling? Do you believe that ever happened?
I don't know how a grown man felt any great danger of bodily injury to himself when he was carrying a loaded gun the entire time. And if he was so afraid, why did he get out of the car? Why did he continue to follow Trayvon? He was not afraid. He was pursuing Trayvon, and he was not going to let another one get away.
At the point of horror, when he did pull the trigger, do you think he would have behaved differently at that point if the person who he claimed to be the assailant, who he claimed to be the aggressor, who he claimed was the one threatening his life, if that person had been white, he would have behaved differently, you say? Or do you?
Yes, I do, and all I need to do is listen to the words of the defense. The defense throughout the entire trial tried to justify killing Trayvon Martin because he was black. The last witness they called said somebody black broke into the neighborhood. That's why George thought Trayvon was a criminal. That's why he lodged a bullet in his heart, and that's okay. That's not okay. Our United States Constitution says that's not okay.
It's great to have you on. Thank you so much for sharing your points of view and your intentions. It's great to have you on. Please come back. Up next, the politics in this case is not just black and white, of course, but part of it is, and why people also see the case through the red versus blue prism, right versus left. By the way, some outrageous thoughts here and voices coming from the right. It's not symmetric, ladies and gentlemen. There's some really crazy stuff coming from the hard right here. And this is Hardball, the place for politics.